Now, I'd like to highlight in this particular video, lesson 2 and lesson 3 fused together. Let us continue from where we left off. We have farming practices. We are talking about commercial as well as small scale farming. Now, when we are referring to commercial farming, we must bear in mind that there are, in fact, certain characteristics. The same would be applied to small scale farming. Now, first and foremost, for commercial farming, large expanses of land are associated either for the cultivation of crops or for the rearing of animals. Secondly, we must bear in mind heavy machinery is in fact utilized, which adds to the efficiency where certain tasks can be executed in a timely manner. Thirdly, monocultural practices are highly involved. When I refer to monocultural practices, folks, we are referring specifically to the planting or the cultivation of one type of crop, primarily because it is easier to treat collectively all of these crops within a specific period of time. Also, you can harvest these crops at an individual point in time. The fourth point has to do with the fact that inorganic chemical fertilizers are largely utilized. Inorganic fertilizers or chemical fertilizers are not natural, they are technically man made or synthetic. They are very fast acting and they can simply be utilized to speed up or to encourage vegetative productivity in that regard. The fifth point has to do with the fact that commercial farming is profit oriented, which will translate to the sixth point where large investments are involved, referring to high or great economic inputs. The sixth point has to do with the fact that large numbers of seeds or seedlings can be cultivated, or even large numbers of animals can be reared at any given point in time. The seventh point has to do with the fact that the excesses or the produce can simply be sold to large markets or even exported either regionally or perhaps internationally. Anybody has any idea what this is? Obviously, it's a truck, which is in fact holding some material at the back of those trees. I'm going to give you approximately a minute or two. You can pause the video if you have to. Now, if you look carefully, this is in fact a cane truck, which is holding obviously sugar cane, which is filled to capacity. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we produced sugarcane, we cultivated sugarcane on a very commercial level. That is, of course, when Carney 1975 Limited was in existence. Now, the image on this particular screen simply shows Bridgeton Castle. And Bridgeton Castle was situated in Couva. It was the location where the sugar factory was located. That was, of course, before the sugar industry collapsed, was shut down in the year 2005. Now, what are the characteristics associated with peasant farming or subsistence farming or generally small scale farming? First and foremost, as the name suggests, small parcels of land are utilized for cultivation or rearing of animals. And most of the time, sometimes these lands may be squatting areas or they may simply be owned by the farmer. All right, and obviously it would require is it would in fact be associated with a small geographical space. Secondly, multiple cropping is associated. Now we heard a couple of minutes ago that monocropping is associated with commercial farming, but in this regard, small scale farming maximizes upon multiple cropping or multi-cropping or mixed cropping, where a variety of crops are grown at any given point in time. Obviously, we also have the rearing of animals as well. Now, this is to maximize on space. And this is important because if it is for the purpose of survival or for the purpose of making a livelihood, right, in terms of physical consumption of food, yes, you would require a variety of food to consume. Thirdly, small investments are involved. The fourth point has to do with the fact that traditional or simple tools are involved because there is not much space. They are mainly involved. Traditional or simple tools are mainly involved. The fifth point revolves around the fact that it is not profit oriented. It is not necessarily profit oriented. As a matter of fact, there may, a big fat may, there may in fact be excesses. It would not be enough to export. It can either be traded or bartered, or perhaps sold to the local markets. Organic fertilizers are widely associated, primarily because it is cheap and easily accessible. When we are referring to organic fertilizers, must bear in mind this can be associated with compost or perhaps manure. Small numbers of crops are planted at any given point in time, and also limited or small numbers of animals can also be reared at any given point in time. Now, there are in fact some environmental impacts associated with large scale farming. Now, first and foremost, as you can see, there is in fact a list here. Now, habitat fragmentation or ecosystem destabilization. Now, folks, you must bear in mind if large scale farming is associated with great clearance of land or large parcels of land being utilized for cultivation purposes or rearing of livestock, obviously, large areas would in fact be cleared, or natural vegetation may in fact be removed to make way for this type of economic activity. And of course, the existing animals there might simply lose their homes. They might be displaced. And in doing so, the ecosystem can be destabilized or fragmented. Now, secondly, soil compaction is a major issue. Why is that? Because the soils would in fact be compressed by heavy machinery simply traversing over the surface of the land, especially if we are referring to large scale arable farming, which is the cultivation of crops. And in doing so, when soils become compact, the air pockets are technically removed from within the soils, and the rates of infiltration or water being absorbed onto the surface toward the subsurface is reduced. Infiltration capacities are reduced, which contributes to what? Overland flow or runoff. When you have more overland flow or runoff, you will technically be associating this with a greater degree of soil erosion and nutrient loss and nutrient transfers or sediment transfers for that matter. This will contribute to eutrophication, as you can see on the screen here. Now, eutrophication is in fact the process whereby nutrients or minerals can simply be transferred from one area into unwanted areas such as waterways, lakes, rivers, and of course, this would add to the increase in nutrient concentration. This would, of course, contribute to a great degree of algae to bloom on the surface of the water. And of course, light would in fact be impeded, therefore resulting in the aquatic plants to simply die. They would be unable to photosynthesize. And when that happens, class, even the animals die within the aquatic or the marine environment. This would contribute to biodiversity decline in the aquatic or the marine environment. Or if you were to piggyback into the first point, because of habitat fragmentation, the organism that thrive there would be pushed to the brink of endangerment or even to the brink of extinction. The fifth point has to do with groundwater contamination. Now, with a great degree of heavy inorganic or chemical or synthetic fertilizers, we must bear in mind that these chemical constituents can simply permeate into the ground over a period of time, especially when they are mixed with rainwater, and they can simply seep into groundwater reserves, contaminating them. Now, many pesticides and fertilizers may have a little bit of acidic concentration and, of course, a nutrient content, which would affect the integrity and the water quality in that regard in the subsurface regions, thereby resulting in groundwater contamination. When we are referring to sustainable agriculture, we must take into consideration people, which refers to the wider society, the planet, which refers to the environment, and also profitability, which revolves around the economic aspects. Now, what is sustainable agriculture? And by definition, you must bear in mind it is a practice of farming techniques which employs knowledge to maximize productivity to the extent where future levels of production or even our future generations are not compromised. Now, if the future generation is compromised or the level of productivity is compromised, obviously, class, that practice is not sustainable. And we must bear in mind that it takes into account the environmental stability. There are, in fact, a number of sustainable agricultural practices. As you can see from this particular list, we have contour cropping, terracing, agroforestry, conservative tillage, organic farming, as well as mixed cropping or multiple cropping. Let's go through quickly. Now, contours are technically demarcations on the surface of the land, which highlights differences in elevation. Contour cropping is technically planting around the hillside along these specific contours. And there are, in fact, certain benefits associated with contour cropping. Obviously, from the insert, you can see that 2D image highlighting how it is associated. But at the bottom, the larger image there, you can simply see how the crops themselves are aligned in relation to the land. Now, the benefits associated with contour cropping include reduced rates of runoff. The actual fluvial movement descending from the land will actually be reduced. Obviously, that will translate into less nutrient transfer, less mineral transfer as well, and also a reduced rate of erosion. Now, class, technically, this will also be associated with a very significant benefit where plants can still be facilitated. Levels of productivity can still be facilitated on the hillsides where the soils are generally thinner than on gentle topography. So you are still maximizing upon the land mass in terms of acquiring productivity, vegetative productivity, but at the same time, you are ensuring that you are not contributing to land to become lowered as a result of erosion or denudation. Now, terracing is different. Terracing is slightly different in that regard. Although it is a sustainable practice, you must bear in mind terracing involves the establishment or the construction of physical step-like formations on very steep hillsides on slopes which are steeper than that where contour cropping is practiced. Areas such as the Philippines, certain parts of China, areas in certain parts of Asia, generally speaking, may in fact encourage this type of cultivation, primarily because the land exists, areas in close proximity to volcanic slopes where the soils are relatively fertile or rich. All right, they will tend to practice this. Now, the benefits of terracing would be similar to that of contour cropping, where you have reduced rates of runoff, reduced erosion rates, reduced nutrient transfers or losses. All right, and in those same step-like formations, vegetation can be facilitated. Agroforestry is a very unique practice where you can simply cultivate amidst existing vegetation or natural forest cover. Now, this is important primarily because we don't clear the entire forest to facilitate any degree of cultivation. Now, why is that significant? Because we can ensure the ecosystem can still have its levels of functionality. All right, we don't destroy the habitats at all. All right, so the organisms can still maintain their levels of productivity in their natural environment, even though there may be minor disturbances, but the organisms can still survive because we are not depleting the entirety of the forest. Another benefit is that you can still acquire your produce as a farmer, while at the same time, you can also derive produce from a natural environment, especially when fruits simply bear seasonally. You can maximize upon this. Nutrient cycles are still encouraged and allowed to be facilitated, especially when a leaf litter from the trees or the leaves simply descend and they are in fact decomposed, adding to the soil fertility and at the same time providing material for organisms to simply break down naturally, ensuring the cyclic or the continuous nutrient replenishment in that particular environment. In addition to this, the maintenance of the vegetation, the natural vegetation that is, would in fact maintain a stable environment where a microclimate, a cooler microclimate can in fact be adopted. All right. This adds also to the vegetation's density instead of simply planting one type of crop where monoculture would in fact be dominant. You are encouraging or fostering a practice here where a great degree of crops can exist while at the same time natural forest cover is maintained. Obviously, trees absorb nutrients at varied rates, and there would in fact be a variety of trees. So technically, no soil content would in fact be exhausted because of our cultivation that exists at the ground level there. Now we also have conservative tillage. And as you can see on the left-hand side, we are seeing conventional tillage, whereas on the right-hand side, we are seeing conservation tillage or conservative tillage. Now, the left-hand side, sorry, on the image on the left-hand side highlights a traditional approach where the entire land would be plowed or dug up. Whereas conservative tillage has to do with only specific areas being dug or entry points being made into the soil to facilitate soil seeding or perhaps seedlings to be planted. And this is important, primarily because the entire landmass is not disturbed when we refer to conservation tillage or conservative tillage. We are technically ensuring that consolidated rock structures are not basically broken apart, even below the subsurface regions. If the land is greatly plowed, there will be a greater surface area which will come into contact with the sunlight because we cultivate mostly during the dry season, not really during the wet season. And obviously, when the sun bakes the earth with that greater surface area for conventional tillage or traditional tillage, that greater surface area being exposed would contribute to soils becoming desiccated and they would be subjected to wind erosion. But conservation or conservative tillage is different. A great surface area is not exposed. As a matter of fact, only specific areas which are deemed worthy for planting would be utilized. So no major disturbance is associated for conservative tillage. Moisture is allowed to be retained, as well as nutrients are in fact allowed to be retained. Wind erosion can have a minimal effect for conservation tillage in comparison to that of conventional tillage. Look at the image on the right hand side. You are seeing little amounts of particulates dispersed into the atmosphere. Look at the image on the left hand side. You are seeing a lot more particulates or materials suspended in the atmosphere. Let's go quickly into organic farming. We said that organic farming is in fact largely practiced by small scale farmers. Now, what are some benefits associated with organic farming? First and foremost, it adds to the crumbly structure of soils. All right, it adds to moisture retention, it also adds to nutrient retention, and in doing so, since organic components are relatively natural, soil micro and macroorganisms can in fact be attracted. So technically, this is a win-win. Although in some instances there are issues associated with organic farming where it is said to be very bulky, but generally speaking, for the natural environment, it can in fact be much more beneficial because we are employing the use of manure, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, the waste or the remains of animals when it decomposed as manure, or we can simply utilize compost, which can simply be derived from the remnants of vegetation or the decay of plant vegetative matter. In some instances, some people practice vermicomposting, where they will utilize the red worms to simply break down the organic material, such as kitchen waste. All right, and that is actually quite beneficial as well. Packs a high amount of nutrient content, very natural, and organisms are in fact not deterred. But this will take us to mixed cropping, where you can see this particular woman behind her. All right, there are in fact a variety of different crops. As you can see, there's an overhead layer, which you call a machan, as we call it locally in Trinidad, which simply facilitate vine crops. All right. And at the bottom of that, you will also have those plant-based crops, those ground-related crops, which are simply growing. So she's maximizing upon vertical space, which is a very important thing. In addition to this, those vine crops overhead can simply act as a cover, right? Helping to capture as well as retain some level of moisture in the ground because of the fact it provides some level of shade. Mixed cropping is very beneficial because you have a variety of crops, primarily because you will simply like to maximize upon the land. Instead of producing for commercial level, you can simply produce on a very domestic or individual level. Mixed cropping is in fact less impacting upon the environment, primarily because it supports diversity of plant species. No soils are said to be depleted when we are referring to mixed cropping in that regard. For instance, if you were to simply plant peas, peas is said to be a leguminous crop. Within the root nodules of peas, there is in fact a number of bacteria such as rhizobium and azotobacter. They basically are nitrogen fixing bacteria. And what they do, they technically live in the root nodules of plants. They fix nitrogen within the soils, which can be absorbed in the form of nitrates by plants. They add to the nutrient content in the floor or in the soil structures. So when you intercrop leguminous crops, that is, with other crops, obviously the nutrients that they tend to produce can actually be utilized by other crops that surround them. So there is at no point nutrient depletion. Now, as it relates to large quantities being produced from commercially grown produce, we must bear in mind what should be done with the excesses. And this is where the concept of agro-processing comes in. Now, agro is a term which refers to agriculture or crops being grown, while at the same time, processing has to do with manufacturing aspects. As you can see from the image there on the screen, there's a whole conveyor belt of apples or tomatoes there. Can we plant a ketchup plant? No, we can't. However, we can simply plant tomatoes or tomatoes, whichever one you pronounce it. And so you could utilize the bulk constituents to simply process that in terms of the manufacture or the production of ketchup, which undergoes a packaging phase, a processing phase. Even at some point, some products may involve also a preservative phase, right, to increase the shelf life of that particular good. Now, for example, preserved mango, right here, is a local snack, I should say, where the mangoes themselves, although they are perishable, they will eventually rot. But if you simply process that, cut it up, simply process that, and you treat it perhaps with sodium benzoate and other different chemical content, you can increase the shelf life of that particular product. So now agro-processing is very beneficial in terms of harvesting in bulk. And instead of allowing them to simply be allowed to decompose naturally, you can maximize upon that in terms of the establishment of a new business. Now, agro-processing bridges the gap between a primary economic activity such as agriculture and a secondary economic activity such as manufacturing or food processing. Two completely different economic activities can be bridged, and this is where agro-processing comes in. So this is important. So you can see how agriculture can simply transcend from a basic means of cultivation to a very profound economic venture involving manufacturing facilities. Now, there are, in fact, certain benefits of agriculture. They can translate into economic as well as social influences. Now, we must bear in mind agriculture is a major foreign exchange earner, which adds to the gross domestic product or GDP of a nation. Now, if we cultivate, we tend to produce more. Once we produce more, there is in fact a very great likelihood that we would in fact be exporting at some point, which would ultimately result in a reduction in our imports or a reduction in the dependency from foreign goods. Once we import less and we produce more, this will add to the economy as well. And obviously, food security can potentially be ensured. In addition to this, agriculture provides a necessity for survival, obviously provides food, which is a major importance. And last but not least, employment opportunities can be derived from such activities. So we'll stop here for today, folks.